My fiancé refused to sign the prenup, saying, "It's an insult." I replied, "I understand." Then I canceled the venue and called off the wedding in a public post. The next morning, his father came looking for me at my hotel. My name is Elena Carter. I'm 32 years old, and until recently, I was engaged to a man I thought I knew. His name was Mason Hale. He was 29. We had been together for 3 years, engaged for 6 months, and supposed to be married in 4. For a long time, I loved saying that out loud. 3 years sounded solid. 6 months sounded certain. 4 months sounded close enough to touch. I had built tiny rituals around the future without even realizing it. The side of the closet I left open for his things. The recipes I saved because he once said they reminded him of childhood. The guest list's tabs on my laptop. The ordinary acts that make commitment feel less like a promise and more like architecture. I was all in. That is probably the part that embarrasses me most now. Not that I loved him, but how completely I trusted the version of him I had been given. Some background matters. I did not come from money. Nothing in my life was inherited except a stubborn work ethic and my grandfather's watch, which still ticks with the kind of steady patience I have spent years trying to imitate. I own a small software development company, and I built it from nothing in my garage 5 years ago. I built it on 80-hour weeks, instant noodles, cheap office chairs, and the kind of fear that keeps your eyes open at 3 in the morning, while you pretend a spreadsheet is not a cliff edge. I wrote code until my wrists burned. I pitched clients who said no. I pitched again. I made mistakes. I fixed them. I hired slowly and carefully. Now the company is stable. We have 15 employees, good clients, and a reputation I nearly broke myself to earn. My life is secure because I made it secure, one decision at a time, one line of code at a time. That is why the prenup existed. Not because I was planning a divorce before a wedding. Not because I thought love was a scam. Not because Mason had to prove anything. My lawyer, who is also one of my closest friends, told me plainly that if I was going into marriage as the sole owner of a business with employees depending on it, I needed a prenuptial agreement. It was not only about me. It was about the company, the contracts, and the people whose rent got paid because the business stayed stable. It was practical, clean, protective, and fair. What was mine before marriage would remain mine. What was his would remain his. Anything we built together after marriage would be shared equally. I was not trying to strip him of anything. I was trying to make sure love did not blur legal lines that could become catastrophic later if life ever turned ugly. 2 weeks earlier, I brought it up carefully. I explained everything. I told him why it mattered. I told him he should have his own lawyer review it. I told him I wanted both of us protected. Mason had listened with a thoughtful expression, reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said, "Okay, let me read it first, but I get why you'd want that." I remember how relieved I felt. That was the first mistake. The deadline to sign was the night before the final, non-refundable $15,000 venue payment was due. We had already put down a $5,000 deposit. I made dinner because I wanted the conversation to stay calm. Nothing dramatic, nothing loaded, just 2 adults finalizing one practical detail before a wedding. The apartment smelled like rosemary and garlic. The music was low. Mason looked handsome in that comfortable, effortless way that used to disarm me. He had one sleeve rolled to his elbows, his hair slightly messy, a glass of wine by his plate. If someone had taken a photograph of us from the doorway, it would have looked like the kind of ordinary happiness people envy in silence. I waited until we were halfway through dinner. "Hey," I said lightly, "I just wanted to check in about the prenup. We need to finalize it before I make the venue payment tomorrow." It was immediate, so immediate it felt rehearsed. His expression changed as if a switch had been thrown somewhere behind his eyes. The warmth vanished. He set down his fork with deliberate care. "I looked at it," he said, "and I'm not signing it, Elena." I kept my voice even. "Okay, tell me what specifically bothers you, and we can have the lawyers adjust it." My issue is the document itself. There was a sharpness in his tone that did not belong to a conversation about paperwork. It belonged to something older. Something bruised, proud, and already angry. "It's insulting," he said. "It tells me exactly what you think of me." "It doesn't." "It does. It says you think I'm here for your money, that I'm some kind of opportunist waiting for a ring and a legal claim." I stared at him for a second, because that had never been anything close to what I said. "Mason, no. It says I built a company before marriage, and I need to protect it. That's normal." "Normal to who?" Corporate women who think every relationship is a merger? That landed harder than he probably intended, maybe because it was so revealing. Not just dismissive, resentful. I put down my glass. This isn't about me being difficult. It's standard. You were always free to have your own lawyer review it. My parents didn't need a prenup. My parents didn't either, I said. That's not the point. He leaned back in his chair and laughed once, but there was no humor in it. No, the point is that you don't trust me. The argument started there and kept circling the same drain. I stayed calm longer than I expected. I explained that the company existed before him. I explained that my employees' futures mattered to me. I explained that the agreement protected both of us. Every time I tried to make it practical, he turned it personal. Every time I tried to discuss terms, he dragged it back to loyalty, insult, trust, love. Then he said the thing that changed everything. It's either me or that piece of paper. He said it quietly, not shouted, not dramatic, quiet enough that for a second it almost sounded reasonable. You need to decide what this marriage is going to be about, he continued. A life together or a contract designed to keep me outside of it. And there it was. Not pain, not fear, not even wounded pride. Entitlement. Something in me went very still. Up until that moment, I had been arguing with the man I loved, or at least I thought I was. But then the romantic haze disappeared so completely it was almost physical, like cold air entering a room. I saw him differently. I saw the way he framed access as intimacy, the way he treated a boundary like betrayal, the way he said outside of it, as if my company, my years, my risk, my sacrifices were already supposed to belong to him by emotional right. I was not looking at my partner anymore. I was looking at a stranger who had mistaken my love for an unlocked door. The strangest part was the calm. I should have been shaking. I should have cried, or raised my voice, or begged him to stop making this ugly. Instead, I felt a deep, almost eerie clarity settle into place. This was not a negotiation. This was a revelation. I understand, I said. He blinked at me. Then I saw it, that tiny shift in his mouth, a restrained, satisfied smile. He thought he had won. He thought the silence meant surrender, that if he made love conditional enough, I would throw logic overboard and call it devotion. Good, he said, relaxing back into his chair. I'm glad you're being reasonable. Reasonable. I nodded once, stood up, and said I needed a minute. I walked into my office and closed the door. Then I canceled the venue first. I lost the $5,000 deposit. It hurt, but not as much as losing another $15,000 on top of it, and certainly not as much as marrying a man who thought pressure was proof of love. After the venue, I canceled the caterer, then the photographer, then the band. My hands were steady the whole time. Finally, I opened the wedding website and the event page. I kept the message short, clean, factual. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the wedding of Elena Carter and Mason Hale, scheduled for October 12th, has been canceled. I apologize for any inconvenience this causes our guests. I wish Mason all the best. I hit post. Then I packed an overnight bag. The apartment I left was one I paid for. The furniture was mostly mine. The lease was entirely mine. But I could not stay there that night. The walls felt too close. The future I had decorated in my head was still hanging in the air like smoke, and I needed distance from the wreckage before I let myself feel it. So I checked into a hotel and turned my phone off. When I woke up the next morning, there were dozens of missed calls and texts waiting for me. Mason, his mother, 2 mutual friends, an unknown number that had tried 3 times in a row. Before I could decide what to do, someone started pounding on my hotel room door. I froze. Then the room phone rang. When I answered, the front desk clerk sounded nervous. Ms. Carter, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a man in the lobby demanding to see you. He says his name is Bruce Hale. He's making a scene. Mason's father had found me. I did not answer right away. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that arrives after betrayal, and it does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks like stillness. It looks like a woman sitting on the edge of a hotel bed with one hand wrapped around a phone that suddenly feels too heavy, trying to decide whether this is the moment her private pain becomes a public performance. My chest was tight, but my mind was clear in the way it had been the night before, clear enough to understand one thing immediately. Bruce Hale was not here to check on me. He was here to contain damage. I asked the clerk to tell him I would meet him downstairs in the coffee shop in 10 minutes. Then I showered, dressed slowly, tied my hair back, and chose the plainest clothes I had in my overnight bag. No softness, no apology, No visible sign that I had barely slept. By the time I stepped into the elevator, I had already decided something important. Whatever happened in that conversation, I would not let him drag me into messiness. Men like Bruce counted on emotional noise. They relied on it. It gave them room to dominate the story. The hotel coffee shop was almost empty. Bruce stood as soon as he saw me. He was a broad man in his late 50s, expensive coat, expensive watch, expensive anger. I had met him plenty of times before family dinners and engagement celebrations, and until that morning he had always worn the same polished smile. The indulgent father. The successful local businessman. The man who shook hands a little too firmly and spoke in confident, amused declarations. He had the kind of public image people mistook for character. That morning the smile was gone. "You embarrassed my son," he said by way of greeting. No hello, no pretense, no wasted motion. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Mason made a choice. I responded to it. His jaw tightened. A choice? You ambushed him with a legal document designed to treat him like a criminal. He had 2 weeks to review it. I told him to take it to his own lawyer. I offered to pay for that, actually. That isn't the point. It is exactly the point. A waitress appeared, hesitant, and I ordered coffee. Bruce waved off the menu. He was too busy performing outrage. You humiliated him publicly, he said, leaning forward. Do you have any idea what kind of spectacle you created? I looked at him for a second before answering. I canceled a wedding after your son gave me an ultimatum. I made a brief announcement so guests would know not to show up to an event that no longer existed. That is not a spectacle, it is logistics. Something flickered in his eyes then, annoyance sharpened by the fact that I was not giving him the reaction he wanted. Bruce was used to women softening under pressure. He was used to raising his voice and watching people reorganize themselves around it. You're emotional, he said, with a sigh meant to sound patient. You're hurt. I understand that. But this is the kind of thing mature people fix privately, not by torching months of planning because of one disagreement. One disagreement? His expression changed slightly, and I realized he had not expected me to interrupt him. Your son told me it was him or the prenup, I said. That was not a disagreement. That was a demand. Bruce leaned back, because he was insulted. No, because he expected me to back down. That's your interpretation. It's the accurate one. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The waitress brought my coffee and left quickly. Bruce watched me take one measured sip and set the cup down again. He looked almost irritated by my calm, as if composure itself were a form of disrespect. Then his tone shifted. Fix it, Elena. There it was. Not a request, not advice, an instruction. Call everyone back. Tell them it was a misunderstanding, a lover's quarrel. Tell them stress got the better of you. You run a company. People will understand pressure. They'll forgive one impulsive mistake. I stared at him. I genuinely think that was the moment I understood the family in full. Not just Mason. The system around him. The confidence. The entitlement. The assumption that I would be the one asked to absorb shame so their son could preserve face. They did not care that he had tried to bully me into a marriage without boundaries. They cared that I had made the consequences visible. The relationship is over, I said. Bruce's eyes hardened. You're making a mistake. No, I said, I'm correcting one. His mouth flattened. The public businessman mask slipped for a second, and beneath it was something uglier. Not grief, not concern, irritation, calculation. A man unused to being denied. You don't want to make an enemy of me, he said quietly. The line was delivered low enough that someone passing by might have mistaken it for concern. But it was not concern. It was a promise. I stood up. There's nothing to fix, I said. Enjoy your coffee. Then I left him there. When I got back to my room, my hands were shaking for the first time all morning. Not because I was afraid of him exactly. Not yet. It was the delayed reaction of seeing the thing clearly. Mason's ultimatum had been ugly, but it was intimate ugliness, the kind people sometimes dismiss as stress or fear or a bad night. Bruce made it simpler, cleaner. He had walked into a hotel and tried to manage me like a reputational inconvenience. He had assumed I would be more frightened of conflict than committed to self-protection. He was wrong, but being right does not make anything easier. The next week was one of the most draining of my life. The messages came first. Mason called 9 times that day. Then he started texting. At first, it was outrage. How could you do this to me? Do you understand what people are saying? You made me look insane. Then came grief, or something dressed to resemble it. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I can't believe you threw us away over paperwork. Then the self-pity sharpened into accusation. After everything I gave this relationship, this is who you are? You never loved me the way I loved you. You chose money over a life with me. I did not answer. That sounds simple when people say it later. I ignored him. I stayed firm. I moved on. In reality, silence is work. It is active. It requires resisting the impulse to correct, defend, explain, soften, comfort, or prove. There were moments I stared at the phone and wanted to type 3 pages, not because I doubted my choice, but because lies itch when they sit unanswered. But I had a growing suspicion that any engagement would become fuel, so I said nothing. Then the story started changing. Mutual friends reached out in strange tones, cautious, curious, too careful. One asked if I was okay with everything going on. Another said Mason seemed really worried about me. A third sent a message so loaded with polite concern it practically glowed. I heard from one of them, eventually, what he was saying. Not that he had refused the prenup, not that he had issued an ultimatum, not that I had ended things after a direct challenge to my boundaries. No. Mason had crafted something much more convenient. According to him, I had been under crushing pressure from work. I had become distant, paranoid, hard to talk to. The prenup conversation had been the final spark in what he implied was some larger emotional spiral. He was devastated, confused, still trying to protect me from public embarrassment. I remember sitting at my kitchen counter after hearing that, laughing once out loud to an empty room. Protect me. That was the version he was selling. The devoted fiancé blindsided by the cold, unstable businesswoman who imploded the wedding and vanished into a hotel. It was clever because it borrowed just enough truth to feel plausible. Yes, I ran a company. Yes, I was stressed. Yes, I had canceled everything abruptly. He took the skeleton of reality and dressed it in a lie, flattering to himself. And because people are often more comfortable with a damaged woman than a manipulative man, some of them believed him. Legally, things had to move next. The apartment was mine. I paid for it. The lease was in my name alone. Mason had lived there with me, but he was not legally on the lease. At my lawyer's advice, I sent a formal notice giving him 30 days to vacate. I sent it by email and certified mail so there would be no confusion later. He called me crying within an hour. Actually crying. I can't believe you're doing this, he said when I finally answered, mostly because I wanted to hear whether he would deny receiving the notice. You need to make arrangements, I said. You have 30 days. Where am I supposed to go? That's something you need to figure out. His breathing hitched in that wounded, theatrical way I used to mistake for sincerity. I'm devastated, Elena. I can barely process what you've done, and now you want me out like I'm some stranger. I closed my eyes. No, I thought. I want you out because now I know you are one. But aloud, all I said was, the deadline stands. Then his mother got involved. Frances texted me that evening. I have tried to stay out of this, but your behavior is cruel. Mason is heartbroken and in no state to handle this kind of hostility. Whatever happened between you, there is no excuse for such coldness. An hour later, another one came. A decent woman would not punish someone she claimed to love this way. That line sat on my screen for a long time. A decent woman. That family loved that phrase. Loved turning femininity into a leash. Be decent. Be kind. Be gracious. Be understanding. Which always somehow meant surrendering your boundaries so their son never had to collide with them. I did not respond to Frances either. Instead, I forwarded everything to my lawyer and repeated the same sentence to anyone who needed one. The deadline was firm, and Mason needed to make arrangements. The pressure intensified because it was not random. Mason called crying. Frances texted moral judgment. Bruce remained silent, which somehow felt more threatening than either of them. Every day carried the same underlying message. Bend, soften, reopen the door, pretend this is salvageable, pretend they had not shown me exactly who they were. I refused. Still, there were nights the apartment felt haunted, not by love, by revision, by the version of us I kept involuntarily replaying and testing. For cracks. The vacations, the family dinners, the evenings he stood in the kitchen eating strawberries over the sink while telling me about his day, the way he held my waist from behind when I was answering late emails, the ring on my finger before I took it off and dropped it into the velvet box, like it might burn through wood if I touched it too long. I kept asking myself the question everyone asks after betrayal. How much of it was real? There is no clean answer to that. Maybe parts of him did love me, Maybe parts of him even believed his own version of events. But love without respect becomes appetite. It becomes access. It becomes a person looking at your life and seeing not who you are, but what they are owed. That realization settled into me slowly over those weeks, heavy and permanent. Then the first sign came that Bruce had decided emotional pressure was not enough. One of my long-term software suppliers suddenly tightened my company's credit line. The explanation was bland: market volatility, revised internal policy, a routine adjustment. My account manager sounded embarrassed, almost apologetic, but unmovable. We had never had an issue before. Our payment history was clean. Our relationship had been steady for years. A week later, a mid-sized client put a promising new project on hold. They were polite about it, vague, overly vague, which is how adults signal that the truth is social, not contractual. One of them finally admitted, in a careful voice, that they had heard unsettling things about the stability of my company and wanted to wait a little before moving forward. I sat at my desk after that call, completely still. Not because I was confused, because I wasn't. Bruce had told me in the hotel coffee shop that I did not want him as an enemy. At first, I assumed that would mean social pressure, maybe ugly private conversations, maybe more attempts to bully me through Mason. I had underestimated him. He was going after the ground under my feet. And for the first time since I canceled the wedding, I understood that the breakup was no longer the crisis. The campaign was. The moment you realize someone is attacking you indirectly is different from the moment you realize how. The first feels like unease. The second feels like gravity. I sat at my desk long after the client call ended, staring at the reflection of my own face in a dark monitor. The office was quiet. My team had already left for the day, unaware that anything had shifted beneath us. That was the part that tightened something in my chest. Not fear for myself, but for what I had built. 15 people trusted this company to remain steady. Bruce wasn't throwing punches. He was changing the air. No accusations, no emails, no threats I could point to and say there. Just conversations happening in rooms I wasn't in, between people who trusted him more than they knew me. A suggestion here, a concern there, a quiet question about whether my company was stable, whether I was stable. It was brilliant in the worst way. Because how do you fight something that technically doesn't exist? You don't sue rumors. You don't confront whispers. You just watch as doors hesitate before opening. I forced myself to breathe slowly, then opened my laptop again and started reviewing everything. Accounts, contracts, cash flow projections. If he wanted to create doubt, then the only thing that mattered was reality holding firm underneath it. Numbers don't panic. People do. So I stayed with the numbers until my pulse steadied. The next few days became a routine of quiet damage control. I called the supplier myself, asked careful questions, listened to careful answers. Nothing explicit, nothing actionable, just a tone shift. With the client, I followed up politely, kept the door open, and didn't push. If I forced clarity, they would retreat. If I stayed steady, there was still a chance they would come back. Outwardly, everything remained composed. Inwardly, I was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. This wasn't emotional fallout. This was strategy. The 30 days passed faster than I expected. Mason did not move out early. Of course he didn't. He stretched every hour of that timeline, not by refusing outright, but by moving just slowly enough to create friction. Boxes half-packed, conversations avoided, logistics dragged. Each day designed to remind me that even without legal standing, he could still occupy space in my life if I let him. So I stopped letting him. I stayed away from the apartment as much as possible. I worked late. I scheduled meetings. I created distance, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I refused to give him the performance he seemed to be waiting for. The collapse, the argument, the moment he could point to and say, "See, this is what you've become." He didn't get it. Everything was handled through messages. Short, direct, documented. Then, 3 days before the deadline, I received an email. Subject line, move out inventory. I opened it expecting logistics. What I got instead made my stomach drop. It was a spreadsheet, neatly formatted, categorized, itemized. At first glance, it looked reasonable. Clothes, shoes, personal items, things I had no interest in disputing. Then I scrolled further. The television, the espresso machine, the sound system, all purchased years before I met him. I sat back slowly in my chair, reading the list again, this time more carefully. Not because I didn't understand what I was seeing, but because I needed to confirm it wasn't some kind of mistake. It wasn't. At the very bottom of the document, separated from the rest like a quiet afterthought, were two words that made my chest go cold. Grandfather's watch. For a second, I just stared at the screen. That watch had been restored after my grandfather passed away. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with it wrapped in a cloth, afraid to touch it too much because it felt like touching memory directly. I remembered the first time I wore it after the restoration, how heavy it felt, not physically, but emotionally, like I was carrying time that wasn't mine. Mason had seen it. He had admired it. I had let him wear it once to an event because he said it made him feel connected to something real. That was it. There was no confusion here. No misunderstanding. This was deliberate. A slow, controlled breath moved through me, and something inside me settled into place. The watch was not about the watch. It was about control, about reaching into my life and claiming something irreplaceable, something that could not be reduced to receipts and timestamps and purchase histories. If he could take that, then he could prove to me and to himself that he still had access, that I wasn't fully out of reach. I closed the spreadsheet. Then I opened a new email. My response was short. Everything listed that you purchased or brought into the apartment is yours. The remaining items are my property. I have documentation for all of them, including the watch. There will be a supervised move-out. You will have access to your belongings only. I sent it. Then I called the only person I trusted to stand in that space without escalating it. Hey, I said when he answered, I need a favor. Billy didn't ask unnecessary questions. That was one of the reasons we had been friends for so long. He listened as I explained the situation, the list, the watch, the tension I could already feel building toward the move-out day. I'll be there, he said simply. I'll bring my dad. His father was a lawyer, calm in a way that didn't just come from personality, but from years of watching people try and fail to bend reality with emotion. If Mason wanted to turn this into a scene, Billy would absorb the energy. If things turned legal, his father would cut through it. It was exactly what I needed. Move-out day arrived on a Friday. I didn't go. Not because I was afraid of seeing him, but because I understood something important. Presence would turn it into confrontation. Absence would turn it into procedure. So I stayed at the office. I tried to work. I failed. Every 10 minutes, I checked my phone. Not for messages from Mason. I had already muted his number, but for updates from Billy. The hours stretched in that uncomfortable way time does when something important is happening somewhere else and you have chosen not to witness it. Finally, my phone buzzed. Billy. I stepped out of my office before answering. Hey, I said. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that carries information before words do. Yeah, he said. So it's exactly what you thought. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes briefly. Tell me. He went straight for the watch. Of course he did. He said you gave it to him, Billy continued. Called it an engagement gift. Said it was supposed to be his now. His mom backed him up immediately. I let out a slow breath. And your dad? Another pause, but this one lighter. He didn't even blink, Billy said. Just told them the same thing you did. Prior ownership. Documentation. Not shared property. If they want to dispute it, they can take it to court. I could almost see it. Mason, frustrated, escalating. Francis, emotional, insistent. Billy's father, calm, precise, untouchable. What happened then? I asked. He tried to push it, Billy said. Got loud. Said you were stealing from him. That this was going to come back on you. My dad just repeated the legal position. No reaction, no argument, just facts. I nodded to myself. Facts don't escalate. They didn't get it, Billy added. None of the stuff that wasn't his. Not the TV, not the machine, not the watch. A small, quiet release moved through my chest. Not relief exactly. Something steadier. Thank you, I said. Hey, he replied. You did this right. Just be ready. He's not done. I knew that. Because people like Mason and families like his don't see boundaries as final. They see them as obstacles. And obstacles are meant to be pushed. Before we hung up, Billy said one more thing. Oh, and he wanted me to tell you something. I waited. He said you're not going to get away with this. I opened my eyes. The hallway was empty, quiet, normal. Yeah, I said softly. I figured. After the call ended, I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle around me. The watch was safe. The apartment would be empty by the end of the day. On paper, that should have felt like closure, but it didn't. Because this was no longer just about the relationship. Bruce had started something he couldn't control through direct pressure. Mason had tried to reclaim ground through emotion and possession. Both had failed. And people like that don't walk away from failure quietly. They escalate. I went back into my office, closed the door, and sat down at my desk. On the surface, everything in my life was still intact. The company, the contracts, the structure I had built. But beneath it, something had shifted. The whispers were still out there. The hesitation, the doubt, the slow erosion Bruce had set in motion. I looked at the numbers again, the projections, the margins, the places where pressure could turn into damage if I didn't move carefully. Then I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. They thought this would wear me down, that I would get tired, that I would retreat, that I would choose peace over resistance because it would be easier. A small, almost humorless smile touched my mouth. They didn't understand something fundamental. I didn't build my life by choosing what was easy. I built it by surviving what wasn't. And if they wanted to turn this into a war of patience, they had picked the wrong person. There's a moment, after everything is technically over, when the truth settles in completely. Not the emotional truth, the strategic one. Mason was out of the apartment. The watch was safe. The legal line had held. On paper, I had won every immediate battle cleanly and without escalation. And yet nothing felt finished, because Bruce hadn't stopped. He had adjusted. The next few weeks taught me something uncomfortable about reputation. It doesn't collapse loudly. It shifts quietly. The supplier never reversed their decision. The tightened credit line stayed in place, explained away with polished corporate language that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Another potential client delayed a contract, not canceled, just delayed, which somehow felt worse. Delay implies doubt. Doubt spreads. No one accused me of anything. No one said my company was unstable. But I could feel it. In the pauses during calls, in the way conversations circled before landing, in the careful politeness that replaces certainty when someone is no longer sure about you. Bruce wasn't attacking my business directly. He was letting people imagine the risk themselves. And that made it stronger, because fear that feels self-generated is harder to challenge than fear that arrives with a name attached. At night, the apartment was too quiet. Not in a painful, lonely way, in a clarified way, like something had been removed, and the space was still adjusting to its own shape. I moved through rooms that were finally mine again, and realized how much of my awareness had been occupied by another person's presence. His shoes by the door, his voice in the kitchen, his expectations woven into ordinary decisions. All gone. In their place was something sharper, awareness. I started noticing things I hadn't before. How often I had softened my tone when talking about work around him. How often I had explained my decisions as if they needed emotional translation. How often I had mistaken agreement for alignment. It wasn't anger that surfaced. It was clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, is much more dangerous. A week later, I ran into one of our mutual friends at a cafe. She hesitated when she saw me. Not because she didn't want to talk, but because she didn't know which version of me she was about to meet. The unstable one. The cold one. The one Mason had described. I saved her the discomfort. "Hey," I said simply, like nothing was fractured. We sat. We talked about small things first. Work, weather, a new place opening downtown. Then, inevitably, it shifted. "I've been meaning to ask," she began carefully. "Are you okay?" There it was. Not accusation. Concern shaped by someone else's narrative. "I'm fine," I said. It ended because he refused to sign the prenup and gave me an ultimatum. That's it. She blinked. That's not what I heard. I know. I didn't elaborate. I didn't defend. I didn't list evidence or replay arguments. I just let the sentence sit there, simple and unadorned. Truth has a different weight when it isn't trying to convince. She studied my face for a second longer than usual, like she was recalibrating something internally. Then she nodded slowly. "Oh, that was it." No dramatic reversal, no immediate apology, just a shift. Small, quiet, real. I left the cafe 10 minutes later, understanding something important. Bruce had influence, but influence isn't absolute. It depends on how much space you leave for it to operate. That realization became the first piece of something new. I didn't fight the rumors publicly, I didn't post explanations, or engage in back-and-forth arguments. Instead, I started doing something far less dramatic and far more effective. I had conversations, one at a time, with the people who mattered. Not everyone, not the entire social circle, just the ones whose opinions actually touched my life. People connected to my work, people whose trust translated into opportunity, people who knew me well enough that a calm explanation would land. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't vilify Mason. I didn't even mention Bruce. I simply told the truth. The prenup, the ultimatum, the cancellation, the attempt to claim my property. And then I stopped talking. What happened after that was subtle, but it was happening. The hesitation in their eyes didn't disappear instantly, but it changed direction from me to the story they had been told. The real turning point came late one night when I couldn't sleep. The numbers were stable enough, the business wasn't collapsing, but it had taken a hit, and I could feel the pressure sitting behind everything like a low hum. I was tired of reacting. So I opened my laptop and did something simple. I searched Bruce Hale, not his website, not the polished version of him. Public records, court filings, business registries, things no one bothers to look at unless they have a reason. At first, it was nothing unusual. Company information, board memberships, charity involvement, the curated life of a man who understood the value of appearing respectable. Then I found the first case, a small claims filing. A subcontractor suing Bruce's company for an unpaid invoice. $5,000. Not a huge number, not something that would make headlines, but enough to matter to the person who hadn't been paid. I clicked into the details. The timeline was familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. Work completed. Final invoice issued. Payment delayed. Communication slowed. Then stopped. Eventually, legal action. I leaned closer to the screen, because this wasn't random. It was a pattern. I searched again. Another case. Different subcontractor. Similar amount. Same structure. Delay. Silence. Pressure. I felt something cold settle into place. Then I kept going. A third. A fourth. By the time I found the sixth case, I wasn't surprised anymore. I was focused. 3 years. 6 small claims cases, all from small businesses. Electricians, painters, landscapers, people who don't have legal departments, people who rely on timely payments to survive. Bruce hadn't been unlucky. He had been selective. He delayed payments just enough to create pressure, knowing most small operators couldn't afford to escalate. If they pushed, he settled late for less than owed. If they didn't, he kept the advantage. It was quiet, legal, technically defensible, and morally precise. The same strategy he was using against me, adapted to a different scale. I sat back slowly, my eyes still on the screen. This wasn't a scandal waiting to explode. This was something else. Truth. Unorganized. Unconnected. Waiting. And for the first time since the hotel coffee shop, I felt something shift completely. Not relief. Not anger. Control. Because Bruce had made one mistake. He assumed I would stay on defense. He assumed I would spend my energy holding the line while he pushed from the outside. But I wasn't just protecting something anymore. I was seeing the shape of the person attacking me. And once you see the pattern, you can decide where to apply pressure. I didn't act immediately. That would have been a mistake. Bruce's strength was patience. Influence built over years. Networks layered carefully. He didn't swing wildly because he didn't need to. People like him survive by appearing stable while applying pressure just beneath the surface. If I moved too fast, too visibly, it would look like retaliation. And retaliation is easy to dismiss. Truth is not. So I slowed down. I went back through everything again. Every case filing, every timeline, every small business name attached to those complaints. I cross-referenced details, dates, outcomes, patterns, and how long payments were delayed, how quickly settlements happened once legal pressure was applied. It wasn't random. It was a system. He pushed just far enough to test resistance. If there was none, he kept the advantage. If there was pushback, he conceded just enough to avoid escalation. Meanwhile, the pressure on my side continued, not aggressively, not in a way I could confront directly, just enough to remind me Bruce hadn't forgotten. One supplier tightened terms again, subtly adjusting payment windows. A long-standing client asked more questions than usual before approving a renewal. I compensated where I could, paid earlier, communicated more clearly, showed stability not through words, but through consistency. Slowly, the bleeding stopped. Not reversed, but contained. That was enough, because I wasn't trying to win quickly anymore. I was trying to last. The social side shifted too. The quiet conversations I had started having began to ripple outward in ways I didn't control, but could feel. A friend I hadn't spoken to in weeks sent me a message out of nowhere. I heard what actually happened. I'm sorry. No drama, no details, just acknowledgement. Another invited me to a small gathering I had assumed I would be excluded from. The tone was normal, intentional, like someone correcting course without making a spectacle of it. Mason's version of events didn't disappear, but it stopped dominating, and that mattered more than people realize, because influence doesn't need to be erased to weaken. It just needs to be questioned. I waited until everything felt steady, not perfect, not resolved, just no longer collapsing. Then I chose a starting point, Spark Electrical. I recognized the name immediately when I saw it in the filings. A small, family-run company with a strong reputation. They had sued Bruce's company for an unpaid invoice just under $10,000. They had pushed, which meant they had felt the pressure, which meant they would understand it. I didn't reach out directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I drafted a letter. Not emotional, not accusatory. Precise. It listed the other cases, names, dates, case numbers, public record information anyone could verify if they cared enough to look. I laid out the pattern without ever using the word. Then, at the end, I added a single line. How many other small businesses has he done this to? No signature, no return address, nothing that connected it back to me. I mailed it from a postbox across town, and then I did nothing. That was the hardest part. Waiting. Because once the information left my hands, it wasn't mine anymore. I couldn't control whether they ignored it, dismissed it, or acted on it. All I had done was connect dots. Whether anyone followed the line between them was up to them. Weeks passed. Work continued. Life settled into something that almost resembled normal again. The pressure from Bruce didn't disappear, but it plateaued. The slow erosion stalled, like he was waiting to see if time would do the work for him. Then one morning I saw it. A headline in a local business journal. Is development titan squeezing small businesses? Local contractors allege pattern of non-payment. I didn't click it right away. I just stared at the screen, because I already knew. Then I opened the article. It wasn't explosive, not dramatic, not written like an accusation. It was measured, careful, structured around interviews with several small business owners who had experienced delayed or withheld payments from Bruce's company. Spark Electrical was mentioned. So were others. The pattern was there, not as a conclusion, but as a question. And questions are harder to silence than accusations. My name wasn't anywhere in it. My company wasn't mentioned. There was no connection drawn between me and the story, exactly as it needed to be. I leaned back slowly in my chair, reading the final paragraph twice. This wasn't destruction. This was exposure. And exposure doesn't explode. It spreads. The effects weren't immediate, but they were real. I heard about the first one through a contact. Bruce had stepped down from a charity board. No public explanation, just a quiet resignation. A week later, an investor pulled out of one of his upcoming projects, citing reputational concerns. That phrase again. The same weapon he had used against me. Turned. Not by me directly, but by truth placed in the right place at the right time. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I just watched. Because the most important part wasn't what was happening to Bruce. It was what was no longer happening to me. The whispers around my company started to fade. Not vanish completely, but lose momentum. Because attention had shifted. Because doubt had found a new direction. Because people who had once repeated quiet concerns about my stability were now reading careful questions about his. A few days later, I got a message from Mason. First one in weeks. Just one sentence. You really think you won? I stared at it for a long moment. Then I set my phone down without replying. Because this was never about winning. And the fact that he still thought it was told me everything I needed to know. I didn't answer Mason. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because anything I said would still be playing his game. Winning, losing, proving, reacting. That entire framework had already cost me too much. So I left the message unread and let silence do what it had been doing all along, separating me from them. The article didn't disappear. That was the difference. A rumor fades if you starve it. A documented pattern doesn't. More small business owners came forward. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to create weight. Enough to turn Bruce's carefully maintained image into something questioned. And once a reputation becomes a question, it never fully goes back to being an answer. He wasn't ruined. That's not how real life works. He was still wealthy, still connected, still operating. But something fundamental had shifted. I heard it through the same quiet channels he had once used against me. A charity board had accepted his resignation. An investor had reconsidered involvement. A city approval process had slowed pending review. No one said why directly. They didn't have to. Reputational risk. The same mechanism, just redirected. For Mason, the fallout was smaller, but more personal. People didn't cut him off. That would have been too clean, too easy. Instead, they adjusted. Invitations came less often. Conversations felt thinner. The version of himself he had presented, the reasonable one, the patient one, the concerned fiancé, didn't quite hold up anymore once people started asking quiet follow-up questions. And the story about the watch didn't help him, because entitlement is easy to ignore when it's abstract. It's harder when it becomes specific, a family heirloom, a documented claim. A failed attempt. People notice those things, even if they don't say it out loud. The last I heard, he was seeing someone new. Not the kind of person he used to talk about wanting, but someone easier. Someone who didn't require boundaries to be negotiated. Someone who didn't make him feel like he had to earn access. That wasn't bitterness talking, just observation. For me, there was no clean victory. No moment where everything snapped into place and the world felt balanced again. I lost a client. I absorbed a financial hit. There were weeks where I slept badly and worked too much and felt the weight of everything sitting just beneath my ribs like something solid and unmoving. But the company held. That was what mattered. The numbers stabilized. The supplier relationship softened again, not fully restored, but no longer tightening. New work came in, slowly, carefully, earned the same way it had always been earned. And the whispers stopped. Not overnight, not dramatically. They just lost energy, because the source of them had become louder than the target, because attention had shifted, because people, when given enough information, eventually recalibrate. One evening, a few months after everything settled into its new shape, I was standing in my bedroom getting ready for bed when I noticed something I hadn't consciously registered in weeks. The watch. My grandfather's watch, sitting exactly where I had left it, on the dresser, untouched, steady. I picked it up, turning it slightly so the light caught the face. It was still ticking. It had been ticking through all of it. The dinner, the argument, the cancellation, the hotel, the threats, the pressure, the quiet, methodical unraveling of everything I thought my life was going to be. Time had kept moving, unbothered, unimpressed. I fastened it around my wrist, feeling the familiar weight settle into place. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had lost something. I felt like I had kept it. The hardest part to explain to people is this. Ending the engagement didn't feel like strength in the moment. It felt like loss. It felt like failure. It felt like throwing away something I had invested years into building. But looking back now, with everything that followed laid out clearly, it was the most important decision I made. Not emotionally, structurally. I didn't just walk away from a man. I protected the foundation of my life. My company, my work, my name, the things that existed before him and would exist long after. That's what survived, not the relationship, not the version of the future I had imagined, but the part I built myself. And that is what's still standing.